You're cutting out. Can you repeat that? Go for production. Go for production. I said go for production.
That's right. You're listening to a podcast about TV and film production. Join us as we converse with industry leaders and gain insight into their strategies, their systems, and best practices in bringing a script to life. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome your host, Brendan Riley.
So this is the very first episode of the Go for Production podcast, and I'm really excited about the direction that we're going to be taking with this season of interviews. And the goal is to try to unpack the process as much as we can and really understand some of the secrets of filmmaking and try to talk with industry leaders and get their take on certain aspects that you may have not thought about before. And so we're going to be interviewing production managers and first ADs and people that work behind the scenes in the production realm. So my name is Brandon Riley, and I work as an assistant director. I work as a line producer, a production manager, do all kinds of things, even produce occasionally. And I've been running a blog for several years called assistantdirecting.com. And this was just an idea I had a couple years ago to add more to the blog and add more ideas and resources to help people in their filmmaking journey. In this episode, we talk with legendary filmmaker Paul Garnes. Paul has served as a producer, line producer, production manager on films and TV series for Disney, DreamWorks, HBO, ABC, NBC, BET, Sony Screen Gems, Magnolia Films, and Paramount Pictures. A graduate of Chicago's Columbia College, Garnes has worked as a VP of Operations and Production for Academy Award winner Jamie Foxx's Foxx and King Productions and the head of production for Simmons-Lathan Media Group. In 2006, Garnes was recruited by Tyler Perry and Reuben to join the Tyler Perry Company, where he served as VP and executive in charge of production until 2009, overseeing the creation of its multi-million-dollar studio and backlot. In addition to daily operations, Garnes supervised over 250 episodes of broadcast TV while at the studio. Paul was the executive producer of the film Selma that was nominated for the 2015 Academy Award for Best Picture and Best Original Song and won a 2015 Golden Globe for Best Original Song. Recently, Paul served as the line producer of ABC's Cloak and Dagger and is currently working as the line producer and executive producer to the series Queen Sugar, which is part of the OWN network. What was the job or the project that kind of got you the push to your big break, in a sense of working on these big shows for all these different networks?
I think it's, in different stages of my career, there's been different productions that have given me that opportunity. Probably, if I had to go back to the origins of it, it was the epiphany I had when I was in college that I wanted to produce instead of direct. I was kind of coming up in that time of independent film, and the director was king. And I went to school thinking, hey, I want to be a director just like everyone else. And I found that I actually was more interested in producing and, had a talent for it. And by talent, I kind of use a definition of Malcolm Gladwell, which, talent is, he defines talent as something that you can do over and over and over again without getting tired of it. I did I had a teacher, Dan Danello, in college, whose brother was part of a comedy group in Chicago. And he wanted to do a movie starring his brother and a couple of his friends from this comedy touring group. And so we did a movie called, I can't remember the name of it now. It's going to come back to me in a second. Shock Asylum. And it was starring his brother, Paul Danello, and his castmate, Stephen Kilbert. And we just produced this kind of really low budget, black and white, independent black comedy. And I loved it. It was then I knew that I have to pursue this as a career instead of directing. And for me, it was that decision to do that, which was the break. Along the way, I had lots of help, lots of connections that got me opportunities. But, it's like that one project put me in a position to say, this is what I want to do.
I think a lot of filmmakers, when they're in college, everybody wants to direct. So it's a benefit if you don't want to direct.
Yeah, no, it's funny because it's the one job on the set. There's only one person that can do it. Everything else, there's multiple people who do it, but the one job, there's only one person. It's the director.
Yeah, so your odds are limited. So when you're, looking for your next job, or somebody's looking for you, maybe somebody calls you on the phone and say, Paul, we got a project for you. What is your determining factor if you're going to say, yeah, let's do it, or maybe not, or
it changes. Now it would be about the people that I was working with. At one point it was, the scale of the production. Like, I was more ambitious to want to do bigger and better things. But now I find myself wanting to work with certain types of creatives, certain types of studios. It's about that process that I think is, the thing that stands out for me.
Very cool. When you start a project, you're in the process before that pre-production. So you might be, building a budget. You might be trying to figure out the scope of the project with the producers. What are the things that you take into consideration when you're building that budget, when you're trying to see how much should this episode cost, how much should this movie cost? Where are you exact versus where do you guess?
Some of it is around the expectations that they have creatively. So as you talk to the studio, it's really trying to understand what it is that they purchased. What's this film that they purchased? You can read the script, but there's usually 2 or 3 different ways to do every script. So the first thing I'm trying to really get a handle on is it realistic what they want to do for the amount of money that they're pitching that they want to do it for? What I found is 9 times out of 10, when you walk in there and they've purchased a project or they want to move forward with a project, they already have in their mind what they want to spend on it. And so part of it is, figuring out how to manage those expectations, like what you're going to get for that money, and making sure that that's a realistic thing that everyone can grasp. So some of the job is kind of managing those expectations and making sure that everybody's on the same page.
So that might mean like shooting on location versus on a stage, or?
Correct. Yeah. Do we build sets? How many days do we shoot? How big is the crew? There's usually 2 or 3 kind of big set pieces that drive the cost. On a movie like Selma, it was like, how do we do the marches, where you have to have, hundreds or thousands of people and horses and dogs and tear gas and, like how do you pull that off? Or, on a TV series, even like something like Cloak and Dagger, a lot of action in it. How do we tool ourselves to be able to do the, amount of stunt sequences or visual effects sequences that match the expectations that, the creative wants.
So you're in the program, you're making the budget. Are you calling up, different stunt coordinators, VFX houses, or how specific are you in some of these details?
It depends, on certain shows when it's a brand new IP, right? Something that no one's done, no one's seen. Yeah, you're organically trying to figure out, putting a cost around those major pieces, the things that are the variables, and really looking out for the things that you may not be, thinking about, to see if it's going to creep up on you in production and catch you. That's one of the challenges in the new model that we do for TV, where you don't really do a pilot much anymore. Everybody goes straight to series. So you're doing a project that's not tested. You don't know what those variables are until you start shooting. So yeah, a lot of it is trying to, guess or use your intuition or experience to figure that out up front.
And how many times do you find yourself in a situation where they want the project to be this amount, and then you go in and do the budget and it comes up higher or lower? Or
it typically is always, the budget's always higher than they want to spend. I don't know if I've been on that show where it's like, wow, we have this abundance of money, what should we do? It's always like, trying to figure out how to squeeze more out of it.
Yeah, I was recently doing a budget for somebody, and they're like, "We got it at 10 million, and we want you to bring it to 7 million." And I'm like, "Okay, we'll see what I can do." We'll have less prop masters or something.
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, it's funny because the business in general has changed a lot. The margins for production, like when people even think of television, they think of the extremes, right? The big Netflix shows or the big HBO shows. But typically, cable television runs the market, and those margins are much less. And so you're really trying to do things with, from the historical way of doing TV, where you had lots of development and lots of hiatuses to retool and refigure out. We go in now on a TV show and do a 70, 80, 90-day run and chunk through the whole series in one time. So it's a much more daunting task than it used to be, for sure.
And, when it comes to the series versus the movie side, how much do you accommodate for actor availability and things like that?
Way more in the TV side, just because, it's such a big commitment usually. Most of the movies I've done aren't, 90-day or 100-day runs on a movie. Mm-hmm. So, in a TV series, actors aren't in every episode, so they want to go out and, do another project or do a film. And so we do spend a lot of time trying to juggle it as much as we can. Obviously, the networks are adverse to giving up first position if you have an actor in first position. So it doesn't always work out.
So, you're in the pre-production phase, and, the project's greenlit. You're moving into an office. You're setting up shop, essentially. What are the things that you like to do to set up a well-organized office or machine, I guess?
The part of the major part that makes, to me, production run smoothly is leaning into that 100-year history of the business. Having people around you that really understand what their role is and hyper focus on the things that they want to do. Having a strong production coordinator that, understands that, their major job is moving information and generating paperwork. And that's like the lifeblood to any producer that needs to keep control over what's going on in production, from schedule to budget to cost reporting. All that stuff is really about having, generating the correct paperwork, processing it in a timely manner, getting it into a form of a report so that you can assess where you are, what's going on. And then that's key for, my role in talking to, my creative side or the studio, is having a real grasp on what's going on and having a plan for what we're going to do to make it what everybody wants it to be.
Is there anything that you uniquely do as Paul Garnes, as a UPM or line producer, that you try to instill in every set or every office?
I generally look at the business. I look at it as, even though it's a business, and I know line producers can be considered the more rigid side of the business, but I do think it's a creative space, and the more you create an environment in which the creatives can do what they do within the box that you construct, I think it's going to be a much better experience. The more that, if I go up and roadblock everything that they want to do and hamper that creative process, it can be detrimental to what I think the final product is, because the culture of the set could be toxic. And I don't believe in yelling and, cussing everyone out, and kind of some of the lineage of the business of, the bad behavior that everyone talks about in the business of, being that, poor kind of PA that gets yelled at because you made the coffee wrong. I don't believe that that's the way that we should operate, and it should be a respectful group of professionals that work together. And if we can create that environment on a consistent basis, it puts everybody into a space, even, when it's like, no, we can't do that. At least, in general, that space is such that, hey, I feel like I can, as a DP, figure out how to do a shot, or as a director, figure out how to block the scene, without feeling like, production is hampering me.
That's interesting. Yeah, I found myself in that same spot many times, where we can't afford something, but okay, we got to be creative and think through those problems.
Yeah.
And so I find myself trying to solve them in a creative way. When you're moving to, you're in production, you're shooting, you have long hours. What is your typical day like in terms of the things that you try to accomplish? Because a lot of times it can be hard to define.
Sure. Everybody approaches it differently, what I've found. I personally follow the unit. I'm not a producer that sits in the office when the unit's out on location or, visit the unit every once in a while. On Queen Sugar, which I'm in production on now, it's a little different because we've committed to an environment creatively where we bring in first-time TV directors. So prep is a big deal for our show just because a lot of times our directors have never worked on a television series, may never have been on a TV series set before. And so we have to kind of build a process in which those directors can come in and thrive, in an environment where they've never done it before. So for me, I spend a lot of time scouting with the next episode. But, in a typical day, a big chunk of my day is, either processing payroll or processing accounts payable. And then dealing with the departments on the next episode, trying to figure out, okay, here's where we are based on yesterday's hot costs. Here's where we need to be at the end of this episode. How do we get there after the fact? Or, okay, now I know, for situational awareness, we're X amount of dollars over for the season. I have to start figuring out how to retool the next few episodes to either cut hours, cut, creative, cut something so that we can, at the end of the season, come in on budget. So it's like a mix of trying to pull off the show, but also trying to anticipate where you're going to end and make little changes along the way so that you can get there, get to the right place at the end.
When you're trying to track cost and see where you're at with the budget, is there a method that you've found that helps you more than others, or is it?
For me, outside of myself, what I have found is, this may sound like a no-brainer, but the better my accountant is, the better I do. And that's mostly because I get more accurate information. What I found is, it's very difficult when there's a lag, when your understanding of where you are financially is even days behind where you really are. If as real time as you can be, you have an understanding of what that is, it allows you to mold the production into a much more paced process instead of, having to do, these massive cuts at the last second. We got to cut 5 days at the end of the schedule, things like that, which again can hamper the creative or, turn a season of television into kind of an anticlimactic experience for the audience because, the last 2 episodes were bottle shows or something. Ideally we're anticipating that and trying to figure that out. For me, it's just, keeping that conversation going with the crew about here's where we are, giving them an understanding of here's what we're going to have to do the next episode. Talk to me about this before you get into that position again. So it's a lot of just kind of counseling the department heads through the process.
That sounds fun and painful. Yeah. What are the current challenges that, in the last, 3 to 5 years that you've faced, on production related things that they keep coming over and over again that you're having to solve?
In general, like I said, the margins in television has become so narrow. Having to produce shows from season to season for less money effectively is always a challenge. It used to be in the old days that it seems like they spent more and more money every season for TV. Now the above the line stretches, but the below the line gets squeezed every year, and that it wears on you over time. Also, the competitive nature of TV and film now is so tough on hiring a crew. You come into, specifically like the Southeast markets like Atlanta or New Orleans, it's so competitive and sometimes it's hard to keep your crew through the whole show because the next best thing is coming in town and everybody starts jumping off your show because, Netflix is in town and they're paying more or it's a 6-month run or, and there's not as much loyalty to the process as it used to be. So, just maintaining a good crew can be very difficult in busy towns. Like New Orleans is very busy right now.
Do you also have issues getting scripts in time?
Always. I mean, that's just, I've given up on that. That's like a dream of mine that, you go into a show and all the scripts are done. It's, for whatever reason, sometimes it's the studio's fault, the network's fault, the writer's fault. It's, it's always a challenge getting scripts in time. It's a dream that one day I'll have a show where it's like, oh, we have all the scripts up front. It doesn't happen though.
It is an ambitious goal. When you're on set, one thing I was thinking about when you talked about earlier is the morale of the crew. What are things that you've been able to do to try to keep the morale up? Because you're working super long hours, and sometimes there might seem like there's no end in sight.
It depends on the show. It depends on, like, our first season of Queen Sugar. It was my first year shooting in New Orleans. I made some really poor decisions on where to put like my stage and versus where we were going to be on location, and didn't force the writers to get rid of all the night exteriors. And I found myself an hour out of town most of the times in the middle of the night. And, after a 13-hour day, and, after a few weeks starts to wear on everybody, right? It's like that long, you wrap at 5 a.m, the sun's starting to come up, and you're looking at like, oh, I got to drive back into the city. It's going to take an hour to get home. Or we've been outside in a muddy field all night in the rain. It's just, those miserable nights start to wear on you. And sometimes it's, look, we got to figure out how to get this production into a better state where we're not out in the middle of the night all the time. How do I get the writers to, give me some interiors on stage? How can I not have so many night exteriors? But sometimes, I'll jump in also on the back end of like the $5 Fridays and offer hey, there's, a second pull tonight and we're going to have an Apple Watch or, something like that where everybody just gets excited to get to the end of the week. And if you can get to the end of the week, then, usually it's like, I get some rest over the weekend, and then I start on that early morning call again on Monday and feel somewhat renewed.
When I talk about night exteriors, one thing that always comes to mind is, you're shooting inside a house and it's at night, and the DP wants to shoot practically at night, and I'm like, let's see if we can compromise. Okay, we'll give you 3 hours of practical night, but the rest of it we're going to black out because you're never going to look out that window.
Yeah, I mean, that's always the joke of it, right? The thing that everyone has to have is the one thing that you end up not using or needing. It's just, over the years, it just becomes kind of a laughable moment where you're like, oh, I can tell this is the one thing that everyone's dying that we have to have it this way, and then it'll fall apart. We won't end up using it, and we've killed ourselves to do it. It just seems like there's at least one time in every show that happens.
Just the overambitious nature of this world of film and TV. When it comes to wrapping up a project, I'm kind of going through the whole stages of production. How involved are you in the post side of things, if ever, or distribution?
It depends on the show. Some shows require much more interaction after the fact. Like, something like Selma, the business of that film lasted for almost 3 years. So after the fact, there was things to do the whole time. From a business standpoint, specifically in the feature side, because of the tax credits, there's a lot of audits and stuff that have to happen after the fact. Where in TV, the studios have departments that handle that, so it's not as big a deal. On the post side, depending on the show, some of the shows we have really strong post producers, and as long as they stay close to what they anticipated they were going to spend, I don't usually have to jump back in, but on certain shows I'll have to come back in and participate in that process to try to make sure that we still end up at the right number at the very end of the production.
So like on average, how long do you find yourself working on a show after you wrap? Is there a general amount of time?
From a day-to-day standpoint, I usually try to get through turning in, kind of our our season recap cost-wise. So however long it takes us to get through a couple of cost reports on the back end on the last episode, and then we usually turn in an overall kind of like before we hand off the financials to the studio. We kind of present a package of, hey, here's where we are this season, and that usually takes anywhere between 4 to 6 weeks after we finish shooting. And then, but like I said, on the feature film, it could be 2 or 3 years.
Interesting. When you think about your job, as a line producer, you're a producer, you're UPM, you're basically a leader on the set, in charge of, making sure this thing happens. What are some books or things you've read that have helped you in your leadership potential or
I mentioned Malcolm Gladwell earlier. I just find any book that deals with kind of critical thinking important. The autobiography of Steve Jobs, I found a very interesting book on leadership, that proves that having brilliance in creative areas doesn't necessarily make you a good leader, and it's also a question of how do you present to the crew, to everyone, how to be the best that they can be. Production inherently seems to bring out the worst in everyone. It's you spend long hours together in very difficult situations. You spend more time with film crew than you do with your family typically. And so it takes a lot to try to craft that process to be something that is a much better thing than it should be. So typically it's, I like biographies. I like, Einstein biography. It's just, things that talk about kind of great leaders in the past that have been part of revolutionary periods of time. And, I can always draw inspiration from, even though it's not the entertainment industry or it's not media in general, there's usually some pointers in there that help you as a person, just in general, to inspire other people to do things that maybe they don't necessarily want to do at the time.
Yeah, I mean, you almost find yourself, putting out a lot of fires and being
Absolutely.
a diplomat in so many ways of, this problem over here, and let's calm down and let's figure this out. Yeah. So when it comes to, the world we live in, it's 2019 right now. There's all this new technology, all these new services for the film industry, all these new apps, and what is your approach to using technology, if any of it, and is there any that you like to use right now?
In general, there's a lot of things that have made the day-to-day process easier. There's new services and, how you deal with extras management. There's, all the apps that the on-set crew like to use to figure out where the sun is in the middle of the day so that we can figure out where we want to be that, in the past you're guesstimating. All those things are great and I think make it easier. To me, at its core, it's still, from the producing standpoint, it really hasn't changed. I mean, it's, managing your resources, managing the money, managing time, managing expectations. And there's really, unfortunately, not a lot of apps to help with that. But, email has helped. And, I try to do my scripts digital now instead of printing a script every time we make a revision, and do my notes on the iPad, and allows me to email faster, and all those things have increased efficiency, and or make us work more often. But like I said, I think the core elements of doing anything well, you have to learn how to do it. The apps are just a tool, not necessarily they're the means, not the ends.
I saw this new report by Greenslate about the technology view from production side, and they're one of the companies that are coming out with digital payroll and time cards, stuff like that. So I just was curious what your take on that was.
I mean, it's made time cards more legible. I mean, it definitely, from a overall standpoint, makes it run smoother. We're doing the same thing, but there are a lot of things I wish we could do even more to make it a better process. Film business is a very funny business because, as much as, the professionals that work in it know, there's, a number of productions in every given town at any given moment, but scale-wise, there's not a lot of shows in the world, right? So any technology made for it, it's not like you can sell it to millions of people. You can only sell it to a small subgroup of people, which inherently makes it more difficult to develop apps for, and or the cost effectiveness of doing it can become challenging. But when you look at services that have become kind of synonymous with the business, like Sync on Set and Synchronize and things that allow us to disseminate information faster, more efficiently, that's great. The downside is, like on many of the shows I've been doing lately, we're in rural areas with bad cell signals, and then you become so dependent on that technology that as soon as you lose it, like I said, if you don't have the core understanding of how to do it without the technology, you end up with some younger crew members that maybe only know that technology as the way to do it, at a loss of productivity, because they just don't know, like, what do we do if we're doing all of our time cards or timesheets or continuity photos electronically, and I can't upload it. It's like, well, print them out, put them in a book. There's a methodology, I think, that still has to carry through even with the technology to make it work.
Yeah, I was on a show where I knew we'd be in the middle of nowhere, and I was like, okay, I know I want to use this one technology, but it's not going to work because our internet reception is not going to be there on several days, and I had to go rent a satellite phone, and it was so painful. Are there any like tools that you use that are not technology tools, but like a certain item or thing that you just like to have with you to help through your day?
I mean, my cell phone and my iPad are my two biggest tools. Those are technology tools, though. Those are the things that, I rely on to, deal with my everyday needs. The iPad keeps me from having to carry my computer everywhere, and I have cellular built into it, so it gives me contact to the world for the most part. But, those are, I would say, my two most important. If I didn't have those two things, and, the proverbial, I'm a line producer, so my watch is always important too. But,
Now, it's the iPad Pro or the iPad?
It's the iPad Pro.
Okay. And you use the stylus?
I use the stylus, yeah. I like to do my notes on the script with the stylus. Yeah,
that's one of my things I'm looking to purchase in the future, but it's a little pricey.
Yeah.
So one thing I want to touch on, I forgot to ask at the beginning, was when you're in pre-production, you're crewing up, how much responsibility are you in charge of hiring individuals versus, having department heads and different things?
I'm usually very, I try to take responsibility of the department heads, and my general assumption is I want my department heads to hire their crew. Because I want to hold my departments responsible. And I feel like as a producer, if I staff your department for you, the first thing that's going to happen when it goes bad is going to be like, this is your crew. You hired these people. So I typically, unless it's, like I said, in this town right now, even, there's some departments that are like, hey, we can't, I don't have anybody. You got to find somebody from out of town. There's nobody here that can do it. But typically it's, try to fire the department heads. Sometimes it can be a little bit of a negotiation with the studio. Once you find the person that you think you want for the show, you have to sell it to the studio, and, maybe they don't have the credits as the studio likes, or maybe they did some project at the studio that went bad in the past, and you have to try to justify why you think that you can manage them in your particular production. But yeah, it's usually the department heads that I'm focused on.
And when you're going after those department heads, I'm assuming most of the time you've worked with these people before.
Not always. I mean, sure, there's some retention. Certain departments where, it's very easy, specifically in logistics. to bring them back from show to show. But creatively, it doesn't always make sense in certain departments. You can't theoretically, your DP, your cinematographer, your production designer may not be appropriate for every production that you go on. But, personally, I feel like, your production office staff, your Teamster coordination, it's kind of the accounting, those core groups can travel heavily with me from show to show. But, every time I get into a production, you go from something like, a period piece, like I did the series Underground, where it's, 1800s, you have horses and, dirt roads, you may need something different if you're going to do, something that's more of a soap opera, modern day. You may want something different than a costume designer or a production designer. So, typically I think you try to tailor those departments to the needs of the show.
Yeah. And, especially if, I sometimes realize if it's really stunt heavy, then I need a certain type of stunt coordinator versus just somebody that's done stunt coordinating once or twice, What's your avenue of finding these people, or are they
it's just organic? I mean, specifically, the business in general is so transient right now. People move around crew-wise from state to state, and every day there's some new people in town, and you're like, hey, so-and-so just moved here from, Vermont. And you're like, oh, well, let's meet him. So it's, you meet them, you try to kind of gauge the personality. Is it someone I can work with? Is it someone I feel like is truthful, honest? Am I going to have a problem believing them when they say, oh yeah, that's handled? And then you get on set and it's like, that's not handled. But you also try to get referrals. I think this business is the lifeblood of this business is referrals. 9 times out of 10, I'm going to hire someone that is a good recommendation from someone that I know, more than just a cold hire and I can't, verify, or I don't know the people that they worked with, so I can't gauge, what that experience really was like for them.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Any last thoughts? We're kind of running out of time. I just wanted to see if anything that you, in terms of your process, that, I think, what you said today was really interesting. But in terms of the filmmaking process, what makes it?
I would say the other thing I'd add is, in general, the business has changed a lot in the last few years. It's become from a studio operations, production operations standpoint, way more corporate. Like HR is so involved in our day-to-day lives now on sets. The stuff that we used to be able to handle internally aren't available to us anymore. Between safety on set and sexual harassment issues and bullying issues, there's like this ever-present, process of more and more regulation over production. It definitely is not the wild, wild west of what it used to be. And, the shows aren't always built around the temperament of the production staff anymore. There's definitely a shift, a trend to regulate the business in a way that I don't think we've experienced or seen in the past. And, I think, a lot of people have easily adapted to it. A lot of people I think are resisting it. But it's definitely a shift in the culture of the business. Like I said, from on-set safety, which, again, people used to do way risky things and that's not acceptable anymore, to, the kind of all boys club that the set used to be is definitely not the same place it used to be. Just watching those trends and trying to make sure, from a producing standpoint, you stay in front of that, so that, not only do you adhere to kind of the modern processes that are being directed to happen, but, always kind of staying in front of the curve and saying, hey, I want to make sure that I'm running the most modern, efficient, quality set that I can.
Very cool. How can people follow you? Are you on social media? Do you?
I am on social media. The only social media that I actively regularly do is Instagram.
Oh, cool.
So, if you follow me, that's the one that I'm going to update on a regular basis.
Do we know what the handle is?
Just Paul Garnes.
Oh, very secretive.
Yeah.
All right. Hey, thanks, Paul. Appreciate it.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to the podcast. If you enjoyed what you heard today, please visit us on iTunes, leave a comment, subscribe, and tell a friend. If you'd like to stay up to date with what we're doing, you can visit the blog at assistantdirecting.com and sign up for our monthly e-newsletter where we will notify you of the new episodes and highlight interesting technology and software in the film industry.